The question I would like to ask is whether the increasing international supervision of electoral processes actually creates incentives for incumbent governments to strategically adapt their use of manipulation. And I will motivate this question with two observations. One is that an increasing number of countries today are holding elections, but they're not always free and fair. And in part because of that, international organizations have increasingly started to supervise and monitor electoral processes with particular attention to the quality of elections. So what are the consequences of this increasing international attention to electoral processes? On one hand, we could think of quite benign consequences, such as that the presence of international monitoring organizations might deter the incidence of election fraud, or that the fact that international observer organizations document the incidence of fraud could give more credibility to opposition groups or citizens who allege that fraud actually occurred. On the other hand, it's also possible to think of less benign consequences or more unintended consequences, and these may stem from the fact that leaders may invite these international monitoring organizations not because they really want to hold free and fair elections, but because they face a lot of domestic and international pressure to do so. And so my research is really interested in these unintended consequences and wants to ask the question of whether domestic actors adapt their manipulative strategies in response to that increased international supervision of elections. In other words, do we observe things such as elites shifting their use of manipulation to other parts of the electoral process in response to that increasing supervision of elections? So in investigating whether incumbent governments adapt their use of manipulative strategies to the presence of monitors, I decided to focus on one particular type of electoral manipulation, which is the incidence of election violence. And election violence is a form of manipulation that is often used to depress turnout or to harass opposition members and so forth. And so in evaluating the expectation that we see a shift in the use of manipulative strategies, that argument really hinges on the assumption that the presence of international monitoring organizations makes the use of election violence and other forms of manipulation more costly and more difficult on election day. And the reason for that is that incumbents would rather not be caught cheating or killing and harassing opposition members in front of international observers. So the empirical implication that I derive from this assumption is that we should see a shift in the use of manipulative strategies like election violence to earlier parts of the electoral process that see much less supervision and much less attention by international organizations. And it's still fair to say that international monitoring organizations send a lot of observers and spend a lot of attention on what happens on election day, but have much fewer resources to actually supervise the campaign period or the pre-election period. And for that reason, the empirically testable hypothesis that I examine in the article is whether the presence of international monitoring organizations leads to an increase in the incidence of election violence in the pre-election period. In an empirical test on a set of African elections, I did indeed find that elections that were monitored by international organizations experienced more pre-election violence than those that were not supervised.